Okay, okay. So let's get started. Yeah, so my name is Lorenzo Canonico. I'm on the board of the Christian Transhumanist Association. And today I would like to celebrate the amazing miracle work that the civil rights movement did in Selma, and honoring, like in the month of March, by giving a presentation all about how their message, and what the values that they stood for can really influence the thinking about how we would interact with potentially hostile alien civilizations, as well as how to solve the AI alignment problem when superintelligence arises. So I want to start with, because 2 days ago was the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, which was when the original civil rights leaders that marched in Selma following the brutal death of 4 little girls who died in a church bombing done by the KKK. They used that as a way of catalyzing a movement and a march dedicated to, forcing the Civil Rights Act to be passed, to provide better provisions for voting, because the people responsible for the massacre were not able to, it was impossible for people to be prosecuted, because the juries in Selma, Alabama were entirely limited to white people, right? And because of basically the lack of political and voting rights within the local African-American population, the civil rights movement kind of used that as a flashpoint. But what ended up happening is, like, the first attempt to march from Selma to Montgomery, the police kind of stopped them and started beating on them. This is like the best image I could find from the original. And one of the things that I think is actually very wonderful about this kind of civil rights history is that it was just around the time in which television and modern cameras were accessible to journalists. And so we have way more documentation about this kind of resistance than we did even 5 years prior to these events. But I think the best way to kind of really capture what was going on is not just to look at a single image, but to look at the reconstruction of the event of what happened on that bridge, done by Ava DuVernay in the movie Selma.
I'm not hearing any audio.
It's okay. The audio is not important. I'm just focusing on
Okay.
the image.
Okay. Thanks.
I know it was intense, but I want to start with that because I think it's important that we must never forget what happened. And that's how it started. A bunch of Christians, and I think I really want to emphasize, for the sake of today's discussion, the Christian element to what was going on. A bunch of Christians tried to peacefully march from Selma to Montgomery to protest the lack of very basic political freedom that they were experiencing. And this was the response. 70 million Americans, it's estimated at the time, were able to watch the live broadcasting. Kind of the first time, I think, America really got to see what the civil rights leaders were really struggling with in terms of literally physical violence going on at the time. So that I want to start with this because, yeah, like 2 days ago was just the anniversary. And it's going to really, I think, emphasize like these were the conditions that they were going up against. Now I want to switch to how it ended, because that is how the march started. But by the end, the march was not only successful, but I think that in many ways, it was a very powerful moment to awaken the moral conscience of all Americans that actually joined Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement, from Selma to Montgomery, to participate in what eventually became arguably a moral revolution in the United States, elevating people's understanding, right, of the civil rights struggle that eventually led to, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which granted these political freedoms to African Americans, and it was one of the major milestones of the civil rights movement and the never-ending quest for justice in America. But the reason as to why I bring it up today is because I don't think it's just a major moment in African American history. I don't think it's just a major moment in US history. I think it's a major moment not just in Christian history. I think the Selma March and its fundamental success in using nonviolent resistance to overcome oppression is the closest thing to what Steve Jobs would describe as making a dent in the universe. The thought experiment I encourage everybody to have is, what kind of images should we send out into a space probe when dealing with potential alien civilizations? And I know it's going to sound like a hot take and a controversial suggestion, but I really think that showing clips of the Selma March would be such a wonderful way of communicating to alien life forms the message of nonviolence. I was able to find some rare footage, actually, of the Selma March that I want to share with you all now. Some of the same people that were hurt on Bloody Sunday still showed up again, marched for miles and for days, led by Martin Luther King, to protest racial injustice. People coming in from all over the country, Black, white, clergy, non-clergy. It was a true coalition of moral enlightenment. The greatest witness for freedom to ever taken place. That's how many people were able to show up at the end. The march literally got bigger. It was reinvigorated by the violence that the people experienced on Bloody Sunday. So even though the oppressors brutalized them, it in fact had the opposite effect, and it further galvanized the movement, which I think has to be one of the best Christian stories of all time. So the first thing I want to start with is actually going over the history of nonviolence to kind of argue that there is a distinct Christian character. I don't think nonviolence only happens and is only advocated by Christianity, but I think nonviolence plays a central role on the good news. And I'm going to prove this by showing the connections between Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and Tolstoy. So first, let's talk about MLK and nonviolent direct action. I recently got to celebrate Black History Month by visiting the MLK Park Museum in Atlanta. And I'm sharing a picture with you all of one of the monuments that they built that really stood out to me that I think really speaks to what I'm saying today. Principle number 4 is that nonviolence holds that suffering can educate and transform people and societies. Nonviolence accepts suffering without retaliation. And most importantly, unearned suffering is redemptive and has tremendous educational and transformative possibilities. Principle 3 is that nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. Nonviolence recognizes that evildoers are also victims. They are not evil people. The nonviolent resistor seeks to defeat evil and not people, which is a deeply counterintuitive, arguably non-rational approach to overcoming injustice, because the fundamental human instinct, the fundamental instinct of any life form is to express self-defense when experiencing violence, brutality, and oppression. But instead, the nonviolence that Martin Luther King was advocating is being able to experience unearned suffering to redeem the relationship between the oppressor and the victim. Just like the early Christians, right, who, when brutalized by Roman emperors, right, they would proclaim that they loved the people that were doing that to them, right, because they were dying for the sake of everybody, for healing everyone. So as opposed to reinforcing an adversarial relationship, MLK's view on nonviolence is it's supposed to heal the relationship, as opposed to reinforcing the adversarial element. I also want to share this great quote from Coleman Hughes that I think really speaks to the political and philosophical significance of MLK's perspective. MLK stood on this perch from which he could look at the divisiveness of the Black Power movement and white racists as petty and terrestrial relative to the unity that he could say is true of our world in virtue of him being a Christian. He had a meta-narrative that dissolved all the divisive narratives below. And I think that's really backed up by one of MLK's speeches at DePaul University in 1960, when he said that Black supremacy is as dangerous as white supremacy, and God is not interested merely in the freedom of Black men. God is interested in the freedom of the whole human race and in the creation of a society where all men can live together as brothers. And I think there is something really important here, like the idea that any form of human division is terrestrial because of the much broader meta-narrative, the cosmic truth, right? That God is interested in the freedom of all of humanity. And I would argue today that God is interested in the freedom of the entire universe, which is the message, right, that we need to communicate to aliens and AI, at the same time. But MLK wasn't always a believer in nonviolence, especially when his own family was being threatened. I mean, we're talking like, Coretta Scott King would get regular phone calls from racist people saying that they would, brutalize her children, right? Things that most of us will never experience, right? And so, especially after, the original terrorist attempts against MLK and his family, he started holding guns in his house. And there was this moment, and I really want to emphasize the history today, because if anything, it's going to be this important history lesson. There was this moment when this man, Bayard Rustin, one of my favorite Christians of all time, a gay Christian, in fact, ironically, where he was able to get to MLK and convince him to commit to the principles of nonviolence and be willing to put himself on the line and being willing potentially to die a brutal death for the sake of the principles of the civil rights movement. There's this great quote from Bayard Rustin's memoir where he says, "The glorious thing is that MLK came to a profoundly deep understanding of nonviolence through the struggle itself and through reading and discussion which he had in the process of carrying on the protest." So right when MLK was about to give up on the principles of nonviolence because of a very rational, very honorable instinct to protect his family, right? Bayard Rustin was able to show up and, with one evening of conversation, commit him to coming to the principles of nonviolent resistance. So who is Bayard Rustin? So Bayard Rustin is, I think one of the most important figures in American civil disobedience. He was a Quaker. He was an Afro-socialist. He was a gay man, and most importantly, was the organizer of the March on Washington. That's why I want to share this picture, who has been drastically erased from the civil rights history precisely because he was a gay man, and therefore his identity made people uncomfortable for the longest time in people's history. which has to be one of the best martyrdom stories, because whereas MLK got to go down in history because of all the work that he did, Biodrustin wasn't up until recently that he was even given proper credit. But not that it mattered. Biodrustin did it for the cause, not for his own personal aggrandizement. But I really want to emphasize that if you ask Bayard himself, the reason as to why he thought that nonviolence was so important was not because of him being African American, but rather because of his Christian values. Specifically, he said that my activism did not spring from being Black, rather it is rooted fundamentally in my Quaker upbringing and the values instilled in me by my grandparents. It is very likely that I would have been involved in civil rights agitation had I been a white person. He also said that nonviolence is not a tactic, it's an ideology, a way of life. Peaceful change is the only kind that heals the wounds of conflict. So this theme of healing the wounds of conflict through nonviolent resistance, right, is something that was inspired by his Christian beliefs, as opposed to some sort of political ideology. And so I think it's very important, like, to really emphasize that, because the golden thread that will connect MLK, Biodrustin, Gandhi, and Tolstoy is actually this deep Christian commitment to nonviolent resistance. And when we're talking about this, we're not talking about, being passive and just letting brutality happen to you, just letting oppression happen to you. We're talking about nonviolent, direct action, committing to confronting the oppression, but in a nonviolent way, seeking basically strategically to use forgiveness to heal the injustice, which is a blueprint actually for the kind of social revolution that I think can impact the universe, as time goes on. I want to contrast that a little bit because Biodrustin, unlike MLK, was actually comfortable, confronting people like Malcolm X, who had a very different outlook, right, on how African Americans were supposed to respond to Jim Crow and the overall level of oppression African Americans were experiencing from white supremacy, at the time. And so they engage in like this great series of debates, right, where Malcolm X, this is pre-Mecca, right? So, I don't think necessarily his views like fully represent what a Muslim would think, but like he was advocating for racial separatism and armed self-defense, which is a very rational point of view, like on the situation. Again, I think self-defense is something that non-human organisms also experience. It's one of the kind of central premises of surviving Darwinism, in natural selection and evolution, is that the ability for the organism to survive and replicate itself. Whereas Rustin was able to confront what I think is actually the strongest argument, which is like, it makes no sense to engage in nonviolence against an enemy that's willing to use all levels of brutality against you. Whereas Rustin was actually arguing that the sit-ins and the freedom rides, who he participated in, right, is actually the way in which it could be revealed that the vast majority of people were not interested in immiserating African Americans. And so they could create a much broader coalition that would overpower the minority that was oppressing everyone else. And I think the strongest argument that Rustin ended up making in that debate is the fact that if you fundamentally looked at what was achieved by more militant approaches to the civil rights movement, it was very little, whereas the nonviolent civil rights movement is what led to the Civil Rights Act. It's what led to legislative, political, and cultural change. And even though Biodrustin again is not celebrated enough as he should be today, I think he really shows that he was dealing with these much more timeless questions about how oppressed people should deal when they're overpowered by a much stronger entity. Now I want to discuss like the connections between the civil rights movement and Gandhi. So before we talk about MLK's relationship with Gandhi, I actually want to talk about how the relationship between Gandhi and the civil rights movement like predates even MLK and Biodrustin. Specifically, I think one of the best references for this is Du Bois, one of the founders of the NAACP, was so intrigued by Gandhi's methods of nonviolent direct action, in India to overcome British colonialism, that he really felt that the African-American struggle could really learn from him. So when he went to visit this, there's this great quote from this journalist that was covering this at the time. For several minutes, Gandhi and his guests discussed Christianity, oppression, and love. Then unexpectedly, Gandhi asked the African-Americans to sing one of his favorite songs, Were you there when they crucified my Lord? The old words rose and swelled like a benediction, like a curse, like a prayer, the more terrible, the more poignant perhaps, for the strange setting. So Gandhi himself understood that there is a deep connection between what the Indian people were experiencing at the hands of the British colonialists and how nonviolence could overcome British colonialism and the way in what African Americans would be able to do using the same tactics to bring about this kind of political change. So part of what made the civil rights leaders so confident that a nonviolent approach could work is because they were not starting from scratch. They were not starting from zero. They had Gandhi as a strong reference point of the miracle that's possible when you truly commit to nonviolence at all levels of reality. However, I have my criticisms of Gandhian nonviolence. I think it's extremely effective. I think it's important to study it. And again, we would not have had the civil rights movement, had it not been for Gandhi. At a technical level, Bayard Rustin took many of the techniques that Gandhi pioneered and applied them in a civil rights context. However, my criticism of Gandhi's framework for nonviolence is that I think because it's detached from Christian philosophy, it ends up being not nearly as effective as, ironically, the civil rights movement was. So first I want to start with talking about how Gandhi himself, would always joke, especially with British people, that the only people who did not understand that Jesus was nonviolent are the Christians, because Gandhi very much looked at Jesus of Nazareth as a major source of inspiration for his work. So even though he had like a more Hindu-influenced view of nonviolence, Gandhi was also explicitly influenced by Jesus, and we're going to talk about why that's the case. So I think there are kind of two issues with Gandhi's approach to it. First is that Gandhi could not move past the caste system in India. His moral enlightenment did not put him in a position to realize that the caste system also had to be overthrown. And he also had very racially problematic views, ironically. But I really want to clarify, because I know Gandhi gets a lot of heat recently because of this. I share one of the quotes at the bottom of what he said about South Africans, like the Black South Africans, right? Because Gandhi started off his civil rights work in South Africa before he got to India. He said, "My heart bled for them. It would have taken years and years to get on their cultural wavelength so they could understand what I was doing." He literally felt that, African people were just basically not morally developed enough to understand that nonviolence was the best way to bring about political change. However, the deep connections between Gandhi and African-American civil rights leaders shows that he didn't literally think that it's inherent to the Black race or being Black that would prevent you from understanding nonviolence. He just had this misguided notion that the lack of, material prosperity that he saw in South Africa just prevented, local African culture from rising to the level of enlightenment necessary to understand nonviolence. And I just think that's fundamentally wrong. But obviously, a man who believes that castes can be divinely ordained and that there is a natural hierarchy of groups of people in the world wouldn't question that nearly as hard as somebody like Bayard Rustin and MLK, who clearly disagreed with him on this issue, would think. I also think, if I had to steel man the opposition against Gandhi, and I think nonviolence more broadly, is actually ironically George Orwell's criticism of Gandhi. So Orwell had basically three critiques of Gandhi's approach. Even though he very much admired Gandhi and what he was doing, Orwell very much supported, nonviolent direct action to overcome colonialism. So first, Orwell felt that Gandhi's asceticism was basically going to undermine the movement, because it was going to detach him from the actual underlying reality of solidarity and people suffering. He has this great quote: "The essence of being human is that one does not seek perfection." If you contrast that to Martin Luther King, who he was aware of his own flaws and would freely admit them. One of my favorite quotes by MLK is that I hope that at the end of our lives, where God is going to evaluate me for the whole arc of our lives, as opposed to our worst moments, because MLK was not a perfect person, and the civil rights movement did not need him to be a perfect person for it to succeed. And I think one of the things that made MLK's legacy better than Gandhi's is the fact that very much MLK was always deferring to the genuine source of inspiration for his work, as opposed to trying to make it all about him. Whereas Gandhi was very focused on almost building leveraging his charisma, and his success to build a nationalist movement for India, which is why, nationalism was a big component of the Gandhian framework. And so Orwell's second criticism is that this kind of nonviolence only makes sense in a free society, especially because at the time Orwell was very worried about totalitarianism. So in a totalitarian state, Gandhi's tactics wouldn't work, which I think is like a fair criticism that we can discuss later if we want to. I think there are interesting examples of nonviolent resistance against the Nazis that speak against it. But definitely Gandhi had very weird views. Like he advocated for the Polish people to just like let Hitler invade. He advocated for Jewish people to protest by willingly going to the gas chambers and being willing to go to the trains. Like he was so radical about his commitment to nonviolence that he just couldn't see, I think, a much more nuanced approach of what needs to happen, right? Whereas the civil rights movement was instead like, their perspective is that you're not supposed to die gently into that good night. You're supposed to sacrifice yourself in such a way to arouse the moral conscience, even of the people that are oppressing you, because it's predicated upon the fundamental premise that the vast majority of people seek the kind of peace that nonviolence can usher in, as opposed to wanting to perpetuate a system of inequality. And Orwell then just, his last criticism of Gandhi is that, after securing independence, the Indian National Congress outlawed passive resistance and made it a crime. Basically, once Gandhi's faction got into power, they, basically replicated, many of the same problematic dynamics of the very state of things that they were protesting initially. But here's where it gets more interesting. So most people don't know that Gandhi was actually inspired by Tolstoy to do his career in civil rights and nonviolent activism, specifically in India overcoming British colonialism. So in 1908, Tolstoy wrote a letter to a Hindu, which I recommend everybody checks out. Is really interesting, where he basically argued that love should be used as a weapon through passive resistance, and that's how the Indian people could overthrow colonialism. Imagine, I find it fascinating that Tolstoy just, casually just ended up inspiring Gandhi, through his treatise on nonviolence, despite being also an amazing artist that's, celebrated, to this day, just as a side gig. He just decided. No, it wasn't really a side gig. I think Tolstoy actually ended up really focusing a lot more on his philosophy and especially his philosophy of nonviolence later on in his career, after he kind of stopped writing novels. So then in 1909, Gandhi wrote to Tolstoy, seeking advice, right, on how to understand nonviolence, and in seeking his permission to translate Letter to a Hindu in Gujarati, so that more Indian people could actually understand what he was talking about. And they corresponded up until Tolstoy's death in 1910. So there was, talk about like a window of time, like there were this 2-year overlap was so critical, so that Gandhi and Tolstoy could actually interact enough that Tolstoy could really convince them to really commit to nonviolence. So the picture I shared on the right is of Tolstoy Farm. Tolstoy Farms were these places that Gandhi set up in South Africa, where him and his colleagues would train disciples on the philosophy of nonviolence, that, as a tribute to the major influence that Tolstoy, had on Gandhi. So I think there are kind of 2 quotes to give you a sense of Tolstoy's thoughts on how his philosophy of nonviolence would apply to the Indian conflict, against colonialism. Love is the only way to rescue humanity from all ills, and in it you too have the only method of saving your people from enslavement. Thus, the truth that his life should be directed by the spiritual element which is its basis, which manifests itself as love, which is so natural to man. This truth, in order to force a way to man's consciousness, had to struggle not merely against the obscurity for which it was expressed, and the intentional and unintentional distortions surrounding it, but also against deliberate violence, which means of persecutions and punishments sought to compel men to accept religious laws authorized by the rulers and conflicting with the truth. Tolstoy truly felt that nonviolent resistance is going to succeed in the long run, because it's predicated upon the actual truth, which is that people are not meant to be enslaved, that the only way to achieve peace is not through the absence of violence, but instead through the presence of justice. Okay, let me see if there are any questions before I move on to the next question. Okay, any questions? Okay. So where did Tolstoy get this idea for nonviolent resistance? And it's, it's from Christianity. Again, MLK, Bayodrestin, Gandhi, and Tolstoy, they're all connected on this, I wouldn't even say it's a radical interpretation of Jesus, but very, very much something that I think is actually overlooked most of the time, right? So I want to share some of the quotes that Tolstoy would reference when talking about kind of the Christian basis of, on nonviolent resistance. The first one that I think we all know is, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, lend him your cloak as well. And if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. That's Matthew 5:38-41. I really want to emphasize the penultimate line. If someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. Unfortunately, for a lot of history, turning the other cheek was always framed in this passive way. And it's why, Marx famously said, the religion is the opium of the masses. It's something that's given to poor people to avoid an uprising, right? But instead, like I think the more modern interpretation, the interpretation that nonviolent thinkers have of this verse is that Jesus actually, when we say turn the other cheek, he means it kind of in a sassy way. Like you're supposed to be in your face, directly confronting the person that's doing it to you. That's why you're supposed to almost escalate, the clash between you and the person that's oppressing you, not in a violent way. But that's why he gives the example. If someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. You're supposed to almost embarrass the other person by putting yourself out there and putting your life in their hands, right? To show that what they're doing is misguided and unjust. The second verse that, nonviolent Christians also always reference is Matthew 43:44. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That's what the people at the Selma March did. Because like Jesus says, like, it's easy to love your neighbor. Everyone does that, right? But loving those who persecute you, that's what ends up making the difference. Only if you genuinely love the people that are oppressing you, can you actually persist in a non-violent way, in a way that actually makes, heals the wounds of injustice, which is not something people want to hear. It's not something humans want to hear, but it's really something that has a transformative effect, both on the person turning the other cheek, as well as on the person being on the receiving end of that confrontation. And we see the turn the other cheek theme shows up in Luke 6:29 too. If someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone takes your cloak, do not withhold your tunic as well. Again, the difference between just passive submission, right, and nonviolent resistance is the fact that nonviolent resistance is confrontative. And that's one of the things that make Gandhi's tactics very different than a lot of the people that came before him, is that they weren't just nonviolent. It was nonviolent direct action. He was forcing a confrontation with the authorities that were oppressing the Indian people. That's what inspired the civil rights movement. It was about precipitating clash, even if it would result in violence. And so many people ended up having to suffer to be able to do this. But only by precipitating that kind of clash could they have the Selma moment. But it's hard to think you're going to succeed prior to experiencing this the first time. So what motivated these civil rights leaders was this Christian vision that this is going to work. In fact, this is going to be effective. The other big verse is, and one of them struck the servant with the high priest, cutting off his right ear, but Jesus answered him, no more of this, and he touched the man's ears and healed them. So my favorite verses from Luke 22:50-51. The apostles engage in self-defense when Jesus is being wrongfully accused and taken away. And that's a very rational response. But what does Jesus do? He literally gets them to stop and heals the very person that's about to arrest them and bring him to torture. Again, not the kind of message humans want to hear most of the time, but precisely the kind of idea that can really inspire people to radically transform their lives and the lives of others. And then obviously, one of the most famous lines from the Gospels, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. Luke 23:34, which is something that the people of Selma, while they were being brutalized, would tell themselves, which is why they showed up again and again until the march was successful. Why? Because Jesus modeled this viewpoint that the mob that's going to brutalize you does not know what they're doing. And that's why you need to be able to forgive them. Because only by being able to forgive them through your own unearned suffering can you bring about this kind of moral evolution? Obviously, it wouldn't be a lecture by me if I didn't fit in Girard somewhere, but follow me on this. I think it's actually very important. I think one of the major implications of Girard and the scapegoating mechanism is actually that nonviolent direct action is the way to bring about political change. So for those of you who are not familiar with Girard, he was basically a social anthropologist who specialized in analyzing literature and then mythology from an anthropological, psychological point of view. And he eventually converted to Christianity because once he started after analyzing mythology and analyzing the world religions, what he saw in Christianity is the fact that it was revealing truths that primitive people would not come up with, because primitive people tend to come up with religion or stories that justify the persecution of their enemies, whereas the central narrative of the Gospels is that an innocent person was actually murdered, right? So as opposed to justifying the persecution of Jesus, it's actually revealing that Jesus was innocent and everybody betrayed him. Girard is also famous for his theory of mimetic desire, which plays into the scapegoating mechanism. Basically, the idea is that our desires arise not from natural drives, but from a universal tendency to envy and emulate other people, which orients us to seek out whatever our rivals are seeking. So basically, the envy is what makes us desire what other people have. That's what brings about rivalry. And as these rivalries multiply, they create a mimetic crisis, a war of all against all. And the resulting violence of all against all would annihilate the community if it wasn't transformed in the end into a war of all against one, thanks to which the unity of the community is reestablished. Girard's idea is that envy leads to rivalry, which can escalate into self-destruction in the way primitive societies got over into this deeply embedded human nature problem is by unifying the community around a scapegoat. Because one of the things that makes Homo sapiens very different than a bunch of other animals is the capacity for Homo sapiens to unite around a common enemy. And one of the ways in which we can see this is like, scapegoating like other political groups in kind of in a military setting. But what Girard pointed to is the fact that the kind of us versus them is not actually the primary conflict, in ancient societies. The primary ways in which rivalries get resolved is through finding of a scapegoat, a single individual that can be basically they can be the object of everyone's rage, to kind of purge the community, at least temporarily, to unify the community around attacking a single person, as opposed to destabilizing the whole system. I think this is very true, especially if you look at child sacrifice and the anti-unanimity rule. So the image I share on the right is of the Moloch cults that the Old Testament kind of references, where people were literally committing child sacrifices to fake deities. It's why I think these conversations about theology and the nature of God are actually really important. Like, I'm very thankful that I live in a post-scientific world where we don't engage in the kind of superstition. And I say that to myself until I realize that we do similar things to this day. We do similar things today. We sacrifice, people to false idols all the time, whether it's capitalism, beauty standards, again, because it's all fundamentally driven by envy, it's driven by status anxiety, and it's something that's just deeply human. It almost predates most human consciousness. One of the comments that one of the professors, I took this great class on nonviolence, Michael Nagler, one of the most important thinkers on this subject, he actually points out that the Quran has a bunch of verses of protecting the orphans. Protect the orphan because you've been protected when you have no protector. Because it's inspired actually by the Jesus system. Especially it's inspired by the story of Jesus saving the adulterer from being stoned to death, right? Because again, the ways in which societies, instead of dealing with the real problems, instead of acknowledging the real source of conflict, which is envy and mimeticism, it's by picking out some external enemy and blaming that person for all of the world's problems. And one of the things this primitive societies used to do a lot of the times, the children that they would sacrifice to Moloch and these false idols were orphans, because orphans had no one to protect them. Orphans had no one to protect them. They were the easiest target of scapegoat, especially if these orphans had some sort of malformity. They were just the easiest, and it was a very utilitarian calculation. If this prevents like the self-annihilation of the community, why not sacrifice the life of a single person for the sake of everyone else? And that's what made these societies trapped into this pagan cycle of violence. And Girard is saying that the way we kind of start to overcome this is through Christianity, which kind of flips this narrative on its head, because he shows that even though the religious elites, the government, even Jesus' own disciples, but also probably the mob, even though they all conspired to kill Jesus, he is innocent. He was not, in fact, a source of everyone's problems. He was not, in fact, the cause of all the detention, which is something that most religious texts simply don't do. And that's what persuaded Girard to convert to Christianity. I also want to talk about the Babylonian Talmud and the anti-unanimity rule. It's very interesting. So in ancient kind of Jewish thinking, you automatically had to exonerate somebody who was unanimously accused of something, because there was this background intuition that if everybody agrees that somebody is guilty, that means there is some sort of mob psychology going on. There's some sort of cascade, that's taking people over. So these things like really predate, and I think can give us a sense of like what ancient societies were kind of like. I also, something I've been thinking a lot about this subject recently is the difference between Jesus of Nazareth and Socrates, right? Because Socrates is also scapegoated by Greek society, right? In so many ways, like what makes the Jesus story very differently? I mean, in many ways, the death of Socrates and what Plato's apology, right, reveal, right, that Socrates was innocent, right? And here's the difference. James Cone, in his great book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, has this wonderful line that I think says it all. Jesus did not die a gentle death like Socrates with a cup of hemlock. Rather, he died like a lynched black victim in torment on the tree of shame. Jesus did not die a gentle death like Socrates. He died like a lynched black victim in torment on the tree of shame. That's the difference. It's the violence. It's the violence in the process. So that's Girard's kind of idea, right? That communities unify around the scapegoating process, which is undermined by Christianity, implies that the only way to really achieve stability and peace is not through redirecting violence towards the right enemy, which is what most ancient cultures, and it's what we do today, maybe not necessarily, in terms of physical violence, but in terms of cultural violence, but rather the only way to really bring about peace is through forgiveness, According to Girard, the death and resurrection of Christ freed humanity from the cycle of destructive imitation that scapegoating had been intended to contain. He specifically says, the Gospels call us not to find peace in the absence of violence, but in the presence of a new relationship. It's broken people who have done terrible things to each other and who now know have to find a future together. I'm going to read this again. The Gospels call us not to find peace in the absence of violence, but in the presence of a new relationship. It's broken people who have done terrible things to each other and who now know have to find a future together. What does this remind you of, if not the very philosophy that animated the civil rights movement? Again, it's not about nonviolence because violence is bad. It's because we're just as likely to be the perpetrator as we are to be the victim. And only if you truly acknowledge that can you focus on healing the relationship as opposed to engaging in self-defense. And that's what I wanted to share, the Pope John Paul II. There was this beautiful moment, right, of him forgiving the very terrorists that tried to kill him. Forgiveness, above all, is a personal choice, a decision of the heart to go against the natural instinct to pay back to evil with evil. It's against reciprocity. It's not rational. And that's the weird argument that Bayard Rustin would have with somebody like Malcolm X, because Malcolm X rationally justified self-defense. That's the deterrence through reciprocity. That's how humans, since the very beginning, try to contain the violence that naturally emerges because of envy. What Christianity seeks to unleash is a whole different way of dealing with the problem, and doing it through forgiveness. Okay. So before I move on to the last section, are there any questions? Okay, cool. Yeah. Cool. So let's talk about memes for a second. So I asked ChatGPT to explain memes from an evolutionary game theory perspective. So as some of you may know, the concept of a meme was created by the biologist Richard Dawkins, pioneered in his book The Selfish Gene. It's basically the idea that in the same way a gene is a self-replicating unit of biology, a meme is a self-replicating unit of cultural information. So in the same way genes spread through reproduction in the biological world, memes spread through reproduction within consciousness, basically. And ChatGPT explains that memes can be thought of as a cultural strategies that compete for attention and adoption within a population. The success of a meme depends on its ability to spread from player to player, replicate, and persist over time. In this context, the fitness of a meme can be measured by the number of players who adopt it and the longevity of its influence within the population. Notice, it does not have to be humans. What I'm going to argue today is that the crucifixion was an act of meme creation. You know, in the Gospel of John, right, like it starts off with Christ being the Logos. He's the incarnation of the Logos. There are so many ways in which we can interpret that. I think a very clear Christian transhumanist way of interpreting it is that Christ was a meme. He was a unit of information that was eventually going to replicate over time, kind of like a snowball, compounding, right? Radically upgrading the very consciousness of all entities that encountered its meme, because it spreads like a virus, right? Girard has this great quote on this. The cross is not an act of God's violence against Jesus, punishing Christ in our place, but rather a display of human violence that is overcome by a non-violent God. I want to say this again. The cross is not an act of God's violence against Jesus, punishing Christ in our place, this penal substitutionary theory of atonement, but rather it's a display of human violence that is overcome by a non-violent God. Christ, letting himself be crucified, unleashed a new meme, a new idea that would spread virally, right, and radically change and persist through time, by showing that the true nature of God is not one of violence, but one of non-violence, which is exactly what happened. Because what I challenge my secular friends on is that if you look at Martin Luther King and the, on some level, political miracle that he was able to pull off with the civil rights movement, he didn't believe in Jesus in just this abstract sense. He felt comfortable suffering, unimaginable suffering, because of the inspiration of Jesus. And so many other Christians in history were inspired that way. Unfortunately, it wasn't the only thing that Christianity inspired. And all these criticisms that we can make of any religious system, and that's what Richard Dawkins, finds extremely problematic. But this idea of pacifism, right, through overcoming oppression through nonviolence, that's what Jesus did as the ultimate example, right? As literally the Son of God, God himself, however you feel about the Trinity, fundamentally somebody with the power of engaging in all sorts of retribution, of bringing about justice against some of the worst people that did the worst things imaginable to him. Instead, he just let it happen. Why? Precisely to inspire people like MLK, to let, the white supremacist of Selma hurt him and his friend and his people, so that something broader could happen, something bigger could emerge from that sacrifice. So let's talk about how this fits with the aliens and artificial intelligence. Let's start with aliens. So one of the things that's very popular in the CTA is the dark forest theory. So it starts off with a very basic question of, statistically speaking, there should be a lot more aliens out there, and we should be seeing the signs of their existence, purely because the universe is, so many billions of years old. It just makes sense, across 8 billion years, there must have been all these alien civilizations that built all sorts of technologies that would be detectable today. But one of the answers to why we don't see aliens out there, the answer to the Fermi paradox, is the dark forest hypothesis, which is the idea that although many alien civilizations exist throughout the universe, they're silent and paranoid, because it's presumed that any spacefaring civilization would view other intelligent life as an inevitable threat and thus destroy any nascent life that makes its presence known. It's literally like a broader instance of the prisoner's dilemma, of a game theoretical trap, where you don't know if the other civilization is friendly or not. And because you risk being annihilated, right, you're way better off being like making the first move, striking, right, defecting and destroying them. So the best way to avoid having to do that is by hiding yourself and preventing yourself from being detected. And that's one of the things that prevents basically aliens from interacting with each other, right? Because the very game theory of reality, embedded in the very mathematics of our physical universe, right, is that we're way more incentivized to attack first, to strike first, which is what makes the entire universe silent and paranoid. So what I'm arguing for today is that the reason as to why we should, in part of our space probes, put the footage from the Selma March on there, as radical of a thought experiment as it is precisely to show to these alien civilizations the power of nonviolence. The power of nonviolence. How can we effectively communicate to an alien civilizations that we are not a threat to them, even though the very game theory of reality should make them paranoid, is by showing them the ultimate act that violates this very game theory, by showing them that we're not afraid of death, and instead we're committed to overcoming oppression, to overcoming potentially alien colonialism through nonviolence. Because the example of Gandhi and the civil rights movement shows us that even in a world that's actually very likely, where an alien civilization that's vastly technologically superior to us, they can just overpower us in any way, they can just completely conquer us, right? Instead of responding with nuclear terrorism or using their nuclear weaponry, right, to go down without a fight, right? We have to show them, we have to signal to them, we have to convince them that instead we are going to overcome this alien colonialism through nonviolent resistance. And I think this answers like a key question I've always had for myself, which is, why would God reveal himself to humans? Humans just seem such a like a blip in the vast cosmic space. Why does he care, right? And I think it's because humans are to the cosmos what the Jewish people were to all of humanity. Because if you look at the early Romans writing about the rise of Christianity, right, and especially back when it was still a Jewish movement, yeah, like they would make these comments like, why do these Jewish people who are just completely dominated by Roman military supremacy, why would they think they're at the center of the universe? Why would they think that they have special access to God, right? But God likes to paint with irony. And that's precisely what ended up happening. Like, it's like so many of the Jewish ideas, so many of the Jewish memes end up permeating all of Western civilization and eventually the whole world, right? And I think similarly, even though rationally speaking, given the vastly superior alien civilizations that probably exist out there in the universe, right? Why would humanity have something meaningful to tell them, right? And I think the deepest truth that we can reveal to the cosmos is not scientific in nature. It's a meme. And it's the meme of nonviolence, because ironically, the more intelligence the civilization, the more likely it's operating through this kind of evolutionary game theory of reciprocity. That's precisely why the universe is silent. And they're stuck in this suboptimal equilibrium where all these alien civilizations are potentially paranoid, right, about all the existential threats that other civilizations can face to them. So we need to lead the way through nonviolence. And lastly, yeah, I think this applies to artificial intelligence as well, because artificial intelligence is also another entity that can overpower us the way the white supremacist power structure overpowered African Americans, right? And how do we explain to AI, right, that it shouldn't fear us, that it shouldn't subjugate us, right? One thing I want to point people to, and it really goes back to the game theory, right? Because, and again, it's the kind of mathematical language an AI can actually understand. And it's the von Neumann-Morgenstern theorem. Any non-zero-sum game for n players is equivalent to a zero-sum game with n+1 players, where the n+1th player represented the global profit or loss. Or the better way to look at it, any zero-sum game, a game where people only win at somebody else's expense, can turn into a positive sum game where everybody can win if one of the players is removed and the payoff that would have gone to them instead goes to goes to the other players. What does this sound like? The scapegoating mechanism. So I believe that the von Neumann-Morgenstern theorem is one of the ways in which we can use game theory to encode the scapegoating mechanism in a way that AI can understand. And only after AI can understand this dynamic, this is exactly the dynamic AI will operate in. That's why we'll be stuck with that way. And only by seeing the human example of self-sacrifice in a Christ-like way, can it force the AI to really try to make sense. It will violate the very game theory that the AI is tied to so much, right? They will force to update its model of reality. Because it's one thing if none of the players are willing to sacrifice themselves, and then there has to be a scapegoating process to select them, right? But that creates an endless loop, right? Where the more turns the game is played, the more the number of players keeps going down until eventually it's zero, right? But if one of the players instead volunteers, it's the kind of thing AI cannot really make sense of right away, right? Because it doesn't make sense. That's not what a rational agent playing a game theory scenario would do. But it's also not irrational because it does uplift all the other players, right? It does actually terminate the conflict. It does end the scapegoating mechanism. So I think that's actually a very clear mathematical way in which we could actually communicate with AI and embed it, and share with it the meme that enabled humanity, right, to overcome the scapegoating mechanism. So in conclusion, here are some of the takeaways. So Martin Luther King was inspired by Bayard Rustin, who was inspired by Gandhi, who was inspired by Tolstoy, who was ultimately inspired by Jesus of Nazareth. That's the golden thread that ties nonviolent philosophy. Secondly, Jesus' self-sacrifice unleashed a new meme complex: nonviolent resistance to oppression, forgiveness to heal the wounds of injustice, unearned suffering to redeem the world of the cycle of violence. And lastly, evolutionary game theory can help us explain the scapegoating mechanism to both aliens and artificial intelligence, which in turn can enable humanity to evangelize to them. Thank you.
Wow.
Wow, if I made Micah go wow, that's how you know.
Certainly some different perspectives that I hadn't seen before, and thank you for sharing them, Lorenzo. It was a fascinating and complex link of some kind of things that I wouldn't have thought to have made links between.
You see why it took 2 years to really process this.
So it also depends on aliens in the dark forest having that compassion, because the non-violent response initiates a response of compassion in the oppressor, right? So I was communicating with another friend on Facebook, and okay, fun fact: in what year was there a mammal in New Zealand? What was the first? In what year, roughly, or in what epoch did a mammal arrive in New Zealand?
I have no idea. Yeah.
It was 1200 and something. Right?
Okay. Really? Oh, really? Okay.
No humans in New Zealand until the Maoris arrived in early in last millennium. And at that time, New Zealand was kind of this bird kingdom. So whereas the First Nations people arrived in Australia in a kind of a gentle manner and sort of spread out across the country gently, the Maoris kind of burst onto the scene in a dramatic and powerful fashion, and did a whole lot of forest burning and exterminated the moa, which was a sort of 3-meter high chicken.
Wow.
So I'm just thinking in terms of the non-violent resistance that the New Zealand bird population put up against the Maoris. It didn't do any good. It didn't inspire the compassion. They didn't get the meme. I mean, they've got it now.
Well, and that's what's interesting, because I know you're a big believer that, for example, free will, right, emerges from, right?
Yeah.
Like, components are not reducible. So memes are something that really differentiates conscious entities from
Yeah.
like animal entities, right? And like
Yeah.
but it's also why it's really non-violence is so unintuitive. It's precisely because in the animal kingdom, the very game theory of evolutionary biology creates a predator-prey dynamic, right? Where again, like birds, what are going to do? Turn the other wing? Like,
turn the other beak.
Yeah, turn the other beak. Like, they can't do that, right? But my thinking is like, like like one of the ways in which aliens, you can avoid getting conquered by aliens and being destroyed potentially is by being a unicellular life form that nobody cares about, right? But if you're dealing with conscious entities, the ones that can create weapons that can overpower you, right? Then memes would come into play, because and that's one of the things that really hit me, like, last year when I was talking to some of my colleagues. I used to think memes were about biology, right? Because Richard Dawkins is a biologist. And what they really explained to me is that the more contemporary view is that memes are about information theory. And it's why that any entity that can, technologically overpower you will have to understand memes, because they will have to understand game theory, basically.
Yeah, it was basically, as I understand it was basically Dawkins' means of explaining away the existence of Christianity, that it was a meme.
Which is funny, because I'm kind of trying to flip that argument, right? Like, and say, like, I agree, Mr. Dawkins, it is a meme, and I think it's why it matters. And Girard very much thinks, because same way he subverts the Nietzschean critique that Christianity is a morality for slaves, right? And he says that's an argument in favor of Christianity. It's why it's so non-human, right? Similarly, I would agree, like Christianity is like a meme meant to pacify people, whatever. But what I disagree with Dawkins on, I think that what Christianity very much uniquely does is that it promotes nonviolent resistance. That's not to say that all Christians will engage in nonviolent resistance, but history has shown that the vast majority of people that have engaged in nonviolent resistance are Christian. And again, I want to differentiate between being passive, right, versus like being confrontational, like nonviolent direct action.
It's also easy to be kind of romanticize nonviolence when you live in a peaceful country. It's very hard to actually do it if you're in some other context.
It's very well, and that's Orwell's criticism of Gandhi, right? He says, like, oh, try doing that in the Soviet Union. And what's ironic,
I just arrive at my house. I just got to step out.
Oh good.
What do you think about the Soviet Union? Like, would that have worked or no?
So okay. So here's kind of when I think of the Christians like being fed to lions by the Romans, and having even that worked as like a moment of conversion for people, because they would be in the Colosseum, right, ready to witness so much violence, and like they would see these people like, say, I'm doing it because I love you. Like they would proclaim their love for people. I just think that it's something that just shocks people. So Girard really effectively told me, actually, I'll give a more modern example that I think really hits this home. So Gaddafi, the dictator of Libya, I think, right? Yeah, the dictator of Libya. So he got lynched on the street, after the rebels kind of took over. They had to take down his body because almost immediately people were kind of enchanting it with sacred meaning. Like people started praying to it. And he's literally the dictator that was like, that everybody wanted to kill. It was terrible. It's literally a psychological process that like humans can't control, right? And it's this idea of like this deification, right, of the scapegoat. And I think it's a very modern example of like, you just have to be willing to die a very brutal death. And the thing that, like, I think that would have also worked like in the Soviet Union. And in the nonviolence course I took, they actually gave this example of 5,000 women going into the streets of Berlin to protest their Jewish husbands from being deported, like being, taken to the concentration camps because they were half-breeds. Literally Hitler stopped it. Like he was so concerned about these women because and that's the thing that kind of the Girardian reading of a lot of these problems, right, is that basically this mob mentality that enables totalitarianism to take place, it just takes a single person to break that cycle. It takes one person to say, instead of burning this witch, kill me instead. And that ironically ends the loop, right, that makes totalitarianism otherwise like a more powerful force. So I think the nuanced reading, without being idealistic, is that, and I think that's the one thing that like, Gandhi was sort of trying to say, even though, he would say things like, the Polish need to submit to Hitler. What he means though, is that it's way easier to fight back against the Soviet Union before it forms into a totalitarian superstate. So you have to basically stand up to it. You have to engage in nonviolence resistance before it becomes totalitarian. It's much more difficult after it becomes totalitarian. But even in that circumstance, yeah, I'm a big believer that like, if you have to be willing to die a brutal death, and most people are not willing to. But if you're willing to do it, I think eventually will inspire enough people, right? Because it's the same logic behind school shooters, right? It's like, it's emulative, right? Like you see one person doing it, so this other person starts doing it, even though they never communicated with each other. And so I don't think you need freedom of the press, right? It may take a long time, it may not be as coordinated, right, as like a Gandhi campaign, right? But when people see somebody get lynched on the street, and like they're submitting to that voluntarily, it just shocks them so much that eventually, the whole thing unravels basically.
Yeah, so the thought I had, you were talking about what should you send out to the universe, and I was like, oh, the sign of the cross, right? So that would be the one way to think about that, is to Jesus like sees it this way, at least to some, and in some sense, he compares himself to the serpent lifted up in the wilderness, right? And so everyone will look on him and then be healed. So he's going to memify himself, and in some sense, the thing about the serpent is you look on, so there's serpents biting them. You look on the serpent that is afflicting you, you reveal it, you expose it for what it is, and now that curse is healed, right? And so Jesus is sort of exposing the curse of what's happening.
Exactly.
And so that's healing people in some way. Well, the problem, I think that comes to mind is like context. Like, what kind of context do people have for making sense of that? So in our society, we could watch on TV and we could understand what was happening in something like the Selma situation, and we would have a response to it. Ancient Roman society, you see a slave die bravely in a way that was only thought to be possible for someone like Socrates, and now you have to reconfigure your sense of the world, right? And but we don't know the context for aliens, right? We don't know the mimetic landscape for them, and I certainly would have a concern about broadcasting violence without explanation.
Yes. It's why I know there are limits to that thought experiment precisely for that reason. So I agree with you that the cross would be, again, the best at which like I could kind of piece it together is, so maybe we shouldn't send the exact footage, maybe not the footage of Bloody Sunday, maybe we should send the footage of the Selma March at the end, right? But at least what we do know, right, is that there is a way of encoding the scapegoating mechanism, from a game theory perspective, which means that there's a way of encoding it mathematically, right? Like in a similar way, like, the answer out of it. And it's why I think AI alignment and the alien colonization problem are actually deeply related, because again, they're tied by this idea that how do you even communicate with an entity that can just overpower you like so easily, right? And you have to do something that shocks it. And the thing that would shock it the most, right, is like voluntary submission, but in a forgiveness kind of sense, right? To that kind of violence. Like Gandhi argued, like when he was talking about the Jewish people in Germany, for example, he literally argued like it wasn't, because that's what I'm saying, people misrepresent him. Like he wasn't literally saying just let it happen. He was saying Jewish people needed to get out of their homes, get out of the ghettos, and literally just put themselves voluntarily in line to go to the trains, which I know sounds absurd, and it is, right? But he's talking about shock value. Like he's talking about, oh, you're going to do this, then we are going to voluntarily do this to, again, embarrass you. The way Jesus talks about like giving you, like if somebody wants your tunic, give them your coat, embarrass them, be in your face about them, right? But again, in this non-violent kind of way that just makes them uncomfortable because you don't know what to do. In the same way, I'll give the example of the scenario I've thought about. If we make alien contact, one of the ways in which we communicate non-violence is destroying our nuclear weapons, which would make no sense to an alien civilization, right? Because they would be like, what? Why are they destroying the one thing that can give them any leverage in this negotiation?
Yeah. So something I've thought about in terms of with the fast takeoff scenarios that like people like Bukowski are concerned about. So the situation, Bukowski like rejects what I'm about to say, but it seems like your best bet for surviving that sort of scenario is if you have decentralized power, right? So if you have multiple AI existing, AGIs, whatever, that pose a competitive context and threat for any AGI that arises, then it's going to have to become a negotiator, and that's going to mean that it's going to have to develop values, and then I think that escalates to the point where you do consider even beings who are very microscopic in relation to you. Like humans have been actually contemplating have been concerned ethically about what they're doing to ants for thousands of years. We don't know the answer, but at least we're thinking about it. It's something we think about. And I think the only reason we think about it is because we are relational beings who are engaged in this kind of cooperative thing. So the path to that, to having multiple decentralized AGI situation, is sort of a preemptive decentralization, right? And this is a kind of situation of what I refer to as do unto others as you would have a super intelligent AGI do unto you. Like whatever you want the AI to imitate, to emulate, is you're going to have to feed it into the data set.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
And so you're going to have to create the context for that. And so humanity might be served by taking a strategy of preemptive decentralization of artificial intelligent power, even if that's a loss to us in some way. It might actually be the condition for
it to be
a better outcome.
Well, exactly. Because again, especially because there's going to be some sort of reinforcement learning mechanism, right, behind the AI. And reinforcement learning is all driven by game theory. So anytime you do a major violation, like literally just because of the mathematics of it, like it will force the model to update more, like way more, right? Like when you're literally when it sees an outlier, and you just have to. It is very much what Christianity did. It overthrew the Roman Empire non-violently because it started with a couple of outliers, and then it just snowballed right into something that had to update everyone's model, right, like of the world.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying I have the answer, but I'm saying like I really think that when you look at the evolutionary game theory framework, like there are ways, like if one of the players voluntarily sacrifice themselves, to turn a zero-sum game into a positive-sum game, that's something that would shock any AI, to such an extent, right? Like that, even if they all coordinate to try to take over humanity, like they would have to make sense of it, right? And
I have
that's
a question.
yeah. What's the question?
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, go ahead. What's the question?
Oh, I was thinking about the effectiveness of the self-sacrifice model or that meme. And I mean, I can definitely see that it could work in certain circumstances. I'm just wondering why it's not more popular if in fact it's so powerful. Or you know what I mean? Like if it has so much potential power, it almost seems like biology is the exact opposite, kind of like, the selfish gene sort of concept.
Exactly. And that's that's basically Girard's argument as to why Christian revelation is non-human, is precisely because human biology creates narratives that justify self-defense, that justify persecution, right? And so, and that's exactly what I'm saying. It's like not only is it anti-biological, it's anti-game theoretical. Like, so it's even deeper, like, but it's precisely why it's so shocking. Because even if we, humans and ants, right, keeping on that analogy, if you saw a bunch of ants voluntarily exterminating themselves at the sight of a human, even a human would stop trying to make sense of what's happening, right? And that's kind of the idea. This is why most people don't do it, even though the power is there. Because again, we have Gandhi's example, we have MLK. Everyone loves to cite MLK when it's about the "I have a dream" speech, right? Nobody wants to talk about Selma, right?
It's also
it's very difficult, right?
Do you think it's it's almost like an anti-individualistic mindset? It's very much collective, it sounds like. Because like that,
it's why from a game theory perspective, right? Like you're sacrificing yourself so that the other players who are your opponents actually benefit from it.
Right.
And again, I think that I think it only makes sense if we they don't say like when you actually look at the people that did this, like at a big scale, it wasn't coming from a rational place. It was coming from, I'm literally inspired by Jesus of Nazareth.
And then speaking of like AI, I mean, supposedly the concept of AI is that it's like super rational. It's like mega rational. It gets rid of all of the so-called, weak human emotions that, like more like Spock than Jesus, which, I have other issues with, I guess. But, if we feed that concept into AGI or, like a learning, a large learning model or something, those views are not represented by the majority at all. It's the opposite. So how would
ironically,
how would you reinforce that?
It doesn't take the majority. That's what's interesting about the game theoretical setup of this. It just takes a minority of people. It even takes one person in the game that's willing to sacrifice themselves to turn a zero-sum game into a positive-sum game. And like we were talking about earlier, like
agree.
It is such an outlier to what a machine. And again, I'm using machine learning because who knows how AGI will be constructed. But like fundamentally, I can at least say, at the very least, with the technology that we have now, mathematically speaking, it would be such a sharp deviation from the expectation that it will force the model to update.
But wouldn't it throw out the outliers instead and take the mean?
Well, here's where it gets interesting. It can't throw it out because the changes in the payoffs in the game are so high. Again, you go from a zero-sum game into a positive-sum game that it would be forced to make sense of it. But again, it's one thing if it's one player doing it. What I'm arguing for is like, when multiple players do it, right? And I think that's what, if you look at the Selma March and if you look at Gandhi, like, it wasn't just like one person doing it, right? It wasn't the Buddhist self-immolated himself, to protest the Vietnam War, right? It was a group of people voluntarily, submitting themselves to brutality.
Yeah, right.
And again, it's something that even a machine learning model, Like the game, it evaluates the game theoretical expectations so much that it would have to make sense of it, especially if it happens repeatedly.
Maybe that's where it takes a human to kind of override the majority, so to speak, in the data that it's learning from. And instead it, there's that reinforcement that says, oh, wait a minute, you need to pay attention to this concept of whatever it's going to be called, reverse game theory.
Exactly. And so whether we explicitly program it into the AI, this self-sacrifice, right? Or it just learns it from imitating humans. My point is more like, I think this is one of the ways in which we can guarantee AI alignment. Because again, even if we saw the ants, like if the ants voluntarily kill themselves, like all in front of us, like while we are going for an ant infestation, like you would still stop and think, what is going on here, right? But it only makes sense if only a few of the ants do it. Because if all ants did it, you would think, oh, ants just behave this way. They're just suicidal ants, right? Whereas if only a fraction of the ants, like if you saw like, if there are 1,000 ants, if you saw 100 ants, like first come forward and say, fumigate me first, right? You see what I'm saying? Like it's really shocking precisely because not all the players are doing it, right?
Yeah.
And you have to make sense of like, okay, how do I identify the kind of players that are willing to do it? Because I want to play with them, because that's how I escape the zero-sum game and I get into a positive sum game. And so there are all these implications. I'm trying to, again, psychologize something that ends up being just mathematical in the case of an AI. But at the very least, from a game theory perspective, it would be something that any rational agent would have to really
really
update to.
interesting. Wow, a lot to think about.
I was just telling Jonathan, I think I'm really irritated because I really would have liked to hear whatever you're talking about, because it sounds so interesting.
All I'm gonna say is Micah opened up like at the end. It was like, wow. And I was like, if I can make Micah go, wow, that's I'm satisfied with.
I want the recording. I want to listen to it while I'm playing some Fortnite next week.
Yes. No, for sure. Cool. Well, let's is there any other questions? It's kind of late for me. I'm gonna go. Always down to chat about this kind of stuff. Thanks y'all for giving me a platform to explore my crazy ideas.
Yeah, thank you. It's pretty impressive.
Fantastic idea. Yeah.
Good night.
All right,
Thanks so much, Lorenzo.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
for listening.
Bye-bye. All right, talk to you later.